Hello everybody, David Shapiro here with a brand new video. Today's video, by popular demand, is about post-labor economics. What happens when AI changes work forever? Real quick before we jump into the show, I just want to plug my Patreon real quick. I have a private Discord server for all Patreon supporters, and I do also have several other Discord servers that I am a part of. One is the Gato community, and the other is the Cognitive AI Lab Discord, which I started at the beginning of my YouTube career. So anyways, hop on over to Patreon if you want to support me, get involved in the private conversations. I also have a few higher tier slots available where I have exclusive access, one-on-ones, group chats, on Patreon and on Calendly. So, on with the show. In order to talk about post-labor economics, we need to start by talking about the history of labor-based economics. For the majority of human history, human labor and our energetic output, the physical force that we can apply on the world, has been the biggest driver of productivity. This was 100% true for our oldest ancestors, hunter-gatherers, who had not yet figured out how to harness energy in nature or the energy of animals. It became slightly less true for our agrarian ancestors as they started to use draft animals such as horses and ox, as well as basic machines like water wheels and levers and carts. Now, granted, a lever and a cart don't actually add energy to the equation, but they do allow you to multiply your own force. The Industrial Revolution happened, which of course everyone talks about that because we're in the midst of the fourth Industrial Revolution, was primarily about force amplification or force multiplication. So in other words, we started inventing machines that could use thermal energy from various fuel sources, such as coal and oil, and they were able to output more energy or more work than we could with just our muscles, and certainly more than even large animals could. Another advantage of machines is that they could metabolize fuel at a far higher rate. So say, for instance, a gallon of gasoline. A gallon of gasoline has about 31,000 calories of energy in it, which is about how much I eat in 10 days. But a large machine can use that gallon of gasoline in a matter of minutes or hours, depending on what that machine is doing, such as if it's a large tractor or combine that's being used to manage a farm, for instance. And so not just the amount of work that can be done, but the amount of energy that can be used was the big game-changing factor for the Industrial Revolution. But as everyone knows, a tractor is not particularly smart. It pulls something, it's not any different than what a human can do, or an ox, it's just bigger, faster, and stronger. So that is where the Industrial Revolution, the Industrial Revolution changed labor-based economics, but you still needed an intelligent human driving that tractor. Now, the Industrial Revolution, of course, is a marvel of mechanical engineering, metal sciences, electronics, and so on. But one thing that we need to point out that is critical is that it all still comes down to the application and use of energy. So human population growth over the last 2 centuries has been tied directly to the amount of energy we had access to, because that also is directly correlated to the amount of food we can produce, the amount of water we can transport and clean and drink. And so basically, what I want to do here is point out that yes, labor is about what humans can do with our hands, our bodies, and what we can do with the use of machines, but we're also still completely dependent upon the underlying sources of energy. So this is an important thing to keep in mind. In the long history of labor and moving up through to today, there's a few basic kinds of labor. And of course, I'm not going to get into every little nuance or detail, but there's 3 overarching categories of labor. So first is manual unskilled labor. This includes moving heavy things, using your hands and body, basically something that you can pick up in an afternoon. So for instance, one of the jobs that I had when I was much younger was I was restocking the shelves at a pet store at night. Didn't take a whole lot of brains, took a lot of muscles, moving heavy things, put here, object A in place B, repeat. Then the next level above that is skilled labor. So this is crafts such as carpentry, electrical work, plumbing, that sort of thing. This also could include hospitality and food service because it's still very kinetic. It's still very much oriented in your body. But these are things that require training. Some of them require certification. But one thing that they almost always have in common is that it requires you to use tools and materials when you're doing skilled labor. Now, there are jobs such as being a doctor or a nurse that are also very kinetic, but those require years and years and years of training and certification. And so those, while they are still embodied work, they are still professions or knowledge work. And so then that leads to the third category, which is professional labor or knowledge work, which includes things like architects, lawyers, doctors, things that you do on computers. Even being an influencer technically could be considered a profession, depending on the kind of influencer you are, right? But one rule of thumb is that you do it in a desk or in an office or in front of a computer. And again, this is not always true. Key example being medical professionals, many of whom interact with people all day, every day, and it requires a tremendous amount of training. Excuse me. Ditto for trial lawyers, right? Trial lawyers have to do a lot of office work, but they also have to go to trial, to go to court before judges and so on, magistrates. So one thing that I need to point out, though, is that we have transitioned largely from a unskilled labor and skilled labor economy to a knowledge-based economy or a services-based economy. So this is one of my favorite graphs of all time, and many people are shocked when I tell them about this. So there's a few things to unpack here. So there's a couple of trend lines. This solid green trend line is the agricultural share of total employment. So basically what has happened is that as time has progressed, the number of farm jobs has collapsed to around 2% of total employment. And it was much, much, much higher. This was, if I'm reading this correctly, I believe it was over 30% just over 100 years ago. So from 30% of jobs were farm jobs to around 2%. And then this dotted green axis is non-agricultural employment, the left axis. Right axis. So this is percentage, yes. And then the left axis is over here. So the total number of employees that were not farm employees has gone up from around 20 million. Now, also keep in mind that the population was growing at the same time, but from 20 million to over 140 million non-farm jobs. And then finally, agriculture employment has collapsed from around, let's say, about 10 to 12 million jobs total to almost non-existent in terms of total number of employees. So this shows how just a single sector, farming, has completely been changed over the years, largely just due to industrial automation through tractors, combines, and economies of scale with mechanized farming. And this is just one sector. So what people are hoping is that today, all the service jobs that we all hate, all the BS jobs, the desk jobs that we hate today, are going to follow this trend line, the way that jobs have gone. But then there's going to be entirely new categories of jobs that come up. Now, as many of you know, I'm rather skeptical of this. Certainly, it would be an interesting future if there's millions and millions or even billions of new jobs created by AI. I am skeptical that this is going to be the outcome, and let me tell you why. Knowledge work or service sector jobs are rooted in what's called cognitive labor or knowledge work. So as farm jobs have been crashing, knowledge work has been rising. So the majority of work today is knowledge work or cognitive labor. This could also be arguably included emotional labor. So emotional labor is a form of cognitive labor that is more common in nurturing and caregiving roles. Tools like ChatGPT and its successors are going to continue to invade the domain of cognitive labor. So we've already seen some examples of ChatGPT used for tutoring, used for medical advice, used for relationship advice. People have even automated companies, the automatic CEO thing. So it is pretty obvious to everyone by now that these models, that ChatGPT, GPT-4, and so on, are capable of cognitive labor. It would be pretty silly to assume that this does not continue. So that leaves physical labor, skilled labor, unskilled labor, and cognitive labor. But if AI is invading cognitive labor first, what are we going to do? Do we go back to manual labor? Do we all pick up arts and crafts and other semi-skilled and skilled labor? It's not necessarily what I want to do, right? If there's a future state where I'm not going to get paid by anyone, but an AI is going to come through and basically take my YouTube gig from me, right? Like, I don't want to go back to shoveling dirt. And anyways, there's machines that are better at it than humans. So why would I do that? So when you look at those three categories, skilled, unskilled, and cognitive labor, and you say, okay, well, machines are better, stronger, and faster and cheaper at all of those than humans, and they're only getting better, that leaves the question, what are we going to do? So as I was trying to figure out, just trying to find a way to do this, it occurred to me that looking at this from supply side or capability of AI versus humans might not be the right way to look at it. So there's the other way to look at it is demand side. So what kind of jobs will people demand or want humans to have specifically? In many cases, you might always prefer to have a human doing something like childcare, hospitality jobs, and other performance-oriented things, such as influencers, right? I don't know about you, but every time I find a video that has, an AI face, AI voice, I click off of it. I don't want, smoke and mirror. I don't want to be lectured at by a sock puppet. I want to see a real human. I want to see their facial expression, their intonation, and I want to develop a parasocial relationship with the people that I follow. And so a parasocial relationship is what most of you have with me, where you have in your mind a model of me and you kind of understand where I'm coming from, right? Even though I might not necessarily know all of you. In fact, I don't know most of you. But the desire for that parasocial relationship, for that connection, that human connection, is something that I suspect that most humans are going to want no matter how good AI gets. Now, that being said, there are probably going to be people that are like, you know what, I don't really care about people. Just give me the information, just give me the entertainment. That's fine. So this leads one final question. Will there be enough of those human exclusive jobs to go around? I don't think there will be. Sure, we might be able to have some back to basics moments where it's like, oh, hey, maybe we can spend more time with our families. Maybe we can spend more time with childcare and education. That's not enough to drive the whole economy. And it's certainly not enough, I don't think, for everyone to have a meaningful career, especially if your interests lie elsewhere. That just doesn't sound good. So now I will introduce you to what I call post-labor economics. And I apologize for the wall of text on this slide, but I figured just a list, you can pause it and read it in much greater detail if you'd like, but I'll just just read the bullet points at the high level. So automation dominance. This is the idea that automation in the form of robotics, AI, and other kinds of automation is going to take over, including for cognitive labor. The second aspect of post-labor economics is the decreased economic value of human labor. Basically, humans can't compete on an economic scale to tractors. Why do you expect that humans are going to be able to compete on an economic scale to AI as its intelligence ramps up? Number three, another criteria or characteristic of post-labor economics is that we will probably see redistributive policies. So redistribution is not necessarily collective ownership. I'm not advocating for socialism. Basically, all I'm advocating for is some form of universal basic income or reverse income tax or that kind of thing. Or negative income tax, sorry. Ownership shifts. So this is the closest thing to socialism or Marxism that I will ever talk about. Because I do not believe in central management of the economy. I don't think that it's a good idea. I do believe in kind of the wisdom of market forces. But what I do anticipate is that the ownership class might shift, and we might shift more towards decentralized ownership models or collective ownership models such as co-ops. And this is not something that I invented. These are things that exist today. But with the aid of AI, it might be easier for ordinary people to band together to collectively buy resources, property, and other capital goods that allow them to participate in the means of production. Now, I'm not going to say that this is going to totally replace all corporations, but if we can stick the landing with technologies like blockchain and decentralized autonomous organizations, then we can have expert, AI CEOs managing our resources for us. Another component of post-labor economics, I suspect, will be price deflation. And so what I mean by this is that as AI gets better at producing more goods and services, the marginal cost of those goods and services is going to collapse. And it's not all goods and services. Some things are going to remain expensive, or at least more expensive than others, but other things are going to get very, very cheap. And I'll go into some of the details in just a moment. We're also going to need new economic indicators. So what I mean by this is that GDP and employment rates, I tried to say both of those at the same time, unemployment rates are not going to be quite as meaningful in the future as they are today. Right now, total employment and unemployment rates are really important indicators for how well the economy is doing. But in a post-labor economy, employment rate won't matter as much. So we might need other metrics in order to measure how well the economy is doing. There's probably also going to be changes in consumption patterns. So for instance, we're going to have more leisure time and less requirement to work. And so that means that we'll probably change where we live, how we eat, access to other services like healthcare will probably decline because we'll be living healthier lives, I hope, and so on and so forth. One of the toughest nuts to crack is actually going to be item number 8 here, which is reshaping our identity and self-worth. And we have actually a few slides dedicated to this coming right up. And then finally, number 9 is regulatory changes that will basically have to be addressed as we transition from a human labor economy to a post-labor economy. Okay, so let's unpack these. I mentioned the ownership of production. So this basic question is, who owns the machines? Who owns the means of production? So if things continue the way that they are, we run the risk of continued trends of capital concentration and or regulatory capture. So regulatory capture is what everyone is afraid of with companies calling for regulation of AI, because it's like, okay, well, if only a few players are allowed to participate, then by virtue of everyone else getting regulated out of existence, only the top players are allowed to play. That would probably be problematic for the rest of us. Now, as I mentioned, I'm not going to advocate for Marxism or socialism or anything like that. I'm not saying that we should collectively seize the means of production. Reason being that market forces still work and centralized management pretty much never works, at least not full-scale national levels. We will need more sophisticated models of ownership than exist today. So, for instance, as I mentioned, co-ops, collective ownerships. I've got a few examples in the next slide, I believe. But otherwise, if corporate payrolls shrink and many of us lose jobs, how then are we going to redistribute the benefits obtained by the technologies? Who's going to reap the rewards? So one component of that is robust redistribution. So whether or not we change ownership, because obviously many people will still kind of have the idea of the value of private property and that sort of thing. And certainly I think that private property is going to exist. That being said, not everyone is going to be a landowner, right? Not everyone is going to own a robot factory or anything like that. So we're going to need to have some kind of robust redistribution policy. So that could come in the form of universal basic income or more sophisticated models. And I always liken it to a hydrological cycle. So money, like water, tends to flow towards some kind of accumulator. Now, in our world, those accumulators tend to be federal governments and the capitalist class in the form of shareholders and corporations. So money tends to flow in those two polar directions. And so then redistribution comes in the form of government handouts, government subsidies, that sort of thing, and taxes, right? Some being skimmed off the top of corporations in order to go to the government and then to be redistributed. So the idea here is then you need a policy that basically makes it rain, right? You want it to rain a certain amount in every region and you want it to rain fairly. You don't want too much rain because that's inflation and that's bad. And you don't want too little rain because that's deflation and that's also bad. So the idea is that these future redistributive policies need to distribute the money, like the water, evenly, fairly, and in a controlled policy. So this is not exactly your grandpa's trickle-down economics theory. I mentioned collective ownership, and there are a few examples of collective ownership out there. Now, granted, none of these are global scale, but we've got a long time before we need to worry about global scale redistribution. Some of them are national scale, which is a good thing, but of course, Norway is not as big as America. So there's a few examples. So one is the Alaska Permanent Fund, which is basically that pretty much every Alaskan gets a annual check for collective ownership of the oil reserves in Alaska. The Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, pretty much the same thing, but for all citizens of Norway. And it is a trust fund that is used to fund public services, and it is funded by their oil reserves. The Mondragon Corporation is an owner-operated corporation in Spain. And then the Green Bay Packers are an NFL team that is unique among the NFL that is collectively owned by 360,000 shareholders. So on the topic of collective ownership and redistribution, Sam Altman does want to do something in line of this, basically saying if OpenAI owns the means of production, aka GPT-4, 5, 6, and 7, and whatever other downstream models they come up with, he has explicitly said that he wants to kind of create a trust fund of sorts that is then used to distribute that surplus of wealth. And this is part of one of his ideas, which is WorldCoin. Now, what I will say is that I'm not sure that this entire project should be piloted and mediated by a Silicon Valley CEO. Silicon Valley CEOs don't exactly have a good track record in terms of being fair and not allowing power to corrupt them over time. Now, this is not a personal indictment of Sam Altman. I very often agree with what he says, but that being said, he is in a position of a lot of privilege and power, and so therefore should be scrutinized. We should engage with a healthy level of skepticism, and I have a feeling that he would invite that healthy skepticism as well. But again, I don't disagree with the sentiment. Were I in his place, I would probably be trying to do the same exact thing. But again, actions speak louder than words. So another thing is that collective ownership doesn't necessarily have to happen on a national scale or a state scale. It can happen on local scales and does in the form of land trusts. So there are plenty of examples of collective ownership that exist today. Now, one thing that is kind of the primary complaint that I get when I talk about redistributive policies such as universal basic income, which is, what about inflation? So there is some merit to this idea. So redistribution, such as universal basic income, can actually be a force for inflation. We did see a small but not negligible effect from the stimulus checks here in America that caused some of the inflation. Now, I will say that aggregate supply and aggregate demand and other supply chain issues are far larger effects of the current inflationary paradigm that we're seeing. That being said, the stimulus checks did cause some inflation because they created higher aggregate demand, which is basically that consumers overall have more money to spend, therefore prices go up. Another thing that can drive inflation is inelastic supply. So as global wealth goes up due to AI, as more productivity goes up and demand goes up broadly, there are going to be goods and services and other supplies that do not scale. So, for instance, one of the most limited resources on the planet is rare minerals like lithium and cobalt. No amount of AI is going to make there be more AI and cobalt, unless, of course, it can dig deeper into the Earth's crust or go to asteroids and mine them there, which is entirely possible. I did mention that in a previous video as one of the possible solutions to mineral scarcity. That being said, there's only ever going to be so much desirable beachfront property in Monaco, right? So there's going to be some kind of scarcity that we cannot overcome, no matter how much cognitive surplus that we have. Now, all that being said, there will be some inflationary pressures that we can't really get rid of, But I think that in the long run, they are going to be offset by and large by some really profound and strong deflationary pressures. So for instance, a deflationary pressure is something that lowers prices. So the job loss that I am anticipating from AI is going to reduce consumer demand until that is somehow fixed or replaced, because with job losses, people are going to hoard their money a little bit more. We saw this happen during the pandemic, for instance, where people spent a lot less money because it was a time of uncertainty. If you lose your job, as many people in some of the communities that I'm a part of have been laid off as part of the tech layoffs, they don't know if or when they're ever going to get a job again. Like, that's a pretty profound thing. So job loss results in deflationary pressure because people are spending money less and driving demand down. In fact, one of the things that my wife and I are doing is we're going to be downsizing, right? Rather than having a house payment, we're going to move to a smaller house that we can fully pay off. Market saturation is another deflationary pressure. So for instance, I did mention earlier that some goods and services will continue to go down in price. One personal example that I have is that the first time I had my novel professionally edited, I spent $1,700 to have a world-class professional editor take a look at my novel. After I got that feedback from her, I then, not long after that, I got access to GPT-4, which has a much larger context window, and I was able to pretty much get developmental feedback or line editing feedback on the entire thing for less than $17 twice. So that is a 100x drop in price. And it's really difficult for people to wrap their heads around the possibility that many goods and services are going to be 1,000x cheaper or 10,000x cheaper in the coming years. So this downward pressure due to the abundance of AI is going to be something that is kind of like a default raise for everyone if it works out that way. So in the case of medicine, or the total cost of healthcare in America is $4.3 trillion per year. Imagine if within a few years, AI is able to reduce the total cost of healthcare in America by a factor of 100. I know that this sounds completely ludicrous, and it probably will take a little bit longer than a few years because the medical establishment is very slow, very onerous, and is very resistant to change. But imagine if your healthcare costs, whatever they were last year, if you spent, a few $100s on a couple medications and one trip to the doctor, or if you have chronic conditions that require a lot of medications and a lot of tests, and you spend, $5,000, imagine if you only had to spend $50 last year instead of $5,000. And that's not with socialist policies or single payer systems where the government foots the bill. I'm talking about the actual cost of healthcare could collapse that much in the long run due to AI. And so that is a tremendous deflationary pressure. So basically, deflation means that your dollar goes much farther. Another thing to consider is that in many cases, there are elastic supplies. So imagine the knock-on effects of AI enhancing everything from supply chains at every level, reducing the need for middlemen, reducing the need for humans and human labor, which is really expensive. So all the goods and services that you get, even if an AI is not directly used in creating that final good or service, it's still going to help the entire process, which means that the entire economy is going to be a lot more elastic, which will also drive down prices. Now we get to the hardest part of all of this. The rest, I think, is going to happen no matter what we do, right? There is just so much economic incentive to drive down prices because that's what capitalism does, right? It seeks efficiency when it's working well. It doesn't always work well, so I'll throw that caveat out. Now, that being said, the inevitable conclusion of all this seems to be that we are going to arrive at a situation where most of us are going to be looking in the rearview mirror and say, bye job, right? Like our conventional jobs are going to go the way of the dinosaurs. And so one of the most common sentiments that I get, and it's always worded slightly different, but there are permutations of this thing, which is I would rather die than live on government handouts. This happens more often than not. There are numerous reasons for this feeling, and it is important to consider because What else is the point of being alive? Excuse me. So there are cultural reasons, ethical reasons, religion, spirituality, and even familial history, identity, gender norms, all kinds of stuff will push people to identify with their job or to really value their self-sufficiency, right? Self-sufficiency, rugged individualism, self-reliance, that sort of thing. These beliefs come from numerous places, whether it's, the culture, particularly here in America, in many families, like you're not considered a real man unless you're a provider, right? Particularly for men, you might expect yourself and be expected to be the primary breadwinner. Careers also do a lot for our sense of purpose, our sense of excellence and competence. A career is a good source of challenge. It's a good way to feel good about yourself, like you've done something. And then for even people that are not men, independence is often predicated on the ability to make ends meet. And so what I mean by this is that if you need to get away from your family or a toxic friend group or whatever, if you need to stay out of prison because you need to stay away, from the street, you might need that good job. And so if you don't have that good job, you might be forced back into a bad situation. So there's a lot of reasons that people are afraid of not having their job. So what I've been able to identify is that after talking with some of these people and thinking through it, is there's two primary threads here. One is, what if I can't take care of myself and the people that I care about? That's really the core fear, at least one of them. Another core fear is, what if my sense of agency and autonomy is taken from me? What if I am just subservient to the whims of the government, right? So one of the potential solutions to this is a concept from ancient Greece called Arete, which is excellence or the pursuit of excellence. So in this case, the ability to feel competent about something in order to feel a sense of mastery and challenge. This is a social phenomenon that was based on social reward and social incentive, even if there was no financial reward. So what I mean by this is that particularly in the elite classes like aristocracy and capitalist class and owner class, the individual behaviors, the individual sense of competence and achievement didn't necessarily come from a career. It came from other achievements, whether they were academic achievements, participating in public life, having a good family, so on and so forth, or even independent competitions, right? Playing polo and yacht racing and all the other stuff that rich people do for fun and for challenge. They do martial arts, they go on adventures and so on and so forth. The acquisition of status symbols is part of that sense of excellence, but there are plenty of other ways to achieve excellence. So other aspects of pursuing the pursuit of excellence include that mastery, that social recognition, right? In many cases, it's a matter of achieving that status in the eyes of the people that you care about. For instance, going back to that idea of being the breadwinner, that head of household recognition, the recognition that you are a good man who takes care of his family, or that you're a good mother who takes care of his family, or whatever it happens to be. There are other ways to signal tribal belonging. For instance, think about all the guys that go to watch the game together at the bar. That is something that gives them a sense of belonging and even a sense of excellence. If your team wins, you feel like you have benefited from that competence. And all of this is possible without a conventional career. Now, that being said, I will say that it does take time to adapt. I know this personally because I left my conventional career just earlier this year, and I kind of floundered around for a while. It was weird, right? And I still struggled with finding, okay, how is it that I can feel productive? How is it that I can feel meaningful and valuable? And so those metrics change, right? Now it's a matter of how many views my videos get. Now it's a matter of what we talk about when I go to the meetups that I host and that sort of thing. Now, that being said, I will say that without a conventional career, finding something to be proud of, mastery, challenge, all of that still exists. And it's still a need too. One example is I picked up a guitar. So when I had my camera moved, you probably saw that I had a guitar in the background. That is a very fancy, nice guitar that I have not yet learned to use that a friend gave to me many years ago. I got a very simple guitar that has only 3 strings to start learning on. But my point is that one of my dreams for myself is that I will one day learn how to play guitar, and I can sit around the campfire and play guitar and sing with my friends. And that is going to be something that I can derive a sense of excellence or a sense of mastery from. Might never get there because I am both tone deaf and I have awful timing. So, anyways, I wanted to close this with physical fitness is one of the most familiar models that people have with pursuing excellence. We all know a bunch of gym bros and gym rats who really bank a lot of their pride and their ego on looking good and feeling good and being fit and looking sexy, right? That is a model that everyone has. A lot of people do this, and it's not for financial gain. It is purely for the pursuit of excellence. And so you take that gym model, and there's all kinds of other stuff you can do with that. A lot of my friends are gamers, and some of them even game competitively. Same exact need being met is you get that challenge, you get the reward of winning, or otherwise getting recognition for your excellence. Now, the other part, and this is actually a little bit harder to address, is autonomy, self-determination. Losing your autonomy is a major cause of burnout, which is true for me. You can check out a video on my other channel talking about burnout. It's also a cause of rebellion and despair. So in many cases around the world, when rebellion has happened, it is because the citizenry lost their sense of autonomy, either due to oppression or just economic collapse. And they said, okay, we're not really happy with this. We're going to take the power back. So this is a legitimate fear. And let me underscore why. If the jobs go away, which I predict they will, then your money goes away. And particularly in America, your personal autonomy is directly tied to your wallet. Your financial power this is actually an explicit policy of neoliberal societies, is that the freedom in a neoliberal society is freedom to spend money however you choose. But this has the dark side of that is that if you don't have money, you're not free, which everyone knows that in America, right? This is something that people have said like, oh, you're only as free as your dollar, right? So this is not a new phenomenon, and this is why people are afraid of AI ultimately taking their jobs, at least one of the reasons. This is a very powerful incentive, and I've actually had conversations over many, many years, particularly with conservatives, that they say that this is actually a very deliberate policy in order to motivate people to work harder. And the idea is that the fear of not having money and the fear of losing your freedom is a powerful motivating factor. And of course, this is the de facto policy of America for several decades. And it's taken even further because part of that fear, part of the motivating people away from poverty is that poverty is something to be ashamed of, particularly in America. Poverty or being poor is seen as a moral failing or even a sin, that if you're poor, not only do you deserve it, but it's your fault because you're a bad person. And in this case, the more money you have, the more free you are, but also the more virtuous or righteous you are. And this goes back to our Protestant and Puritan roots. So personal agency or self-determination or autonomy is inextricably tied to your financial power. This is a very problematic mentality. And I'm not saying that like if you feel this way, it's not your fault. I'm saying that like the fact that this exists in our zeitgeist that's the problem. Now, with post-labor economics, this is my hope and dream, is that with post-labor economics, if optimal redistribution, so remember the idea of the rain clouds dropping rain everywhere, if optimal redistribution is achieved, then our individual autonomy should increase. So what I mean by this is that first, abundance of free time. Imagine that your need for working a day job goes away. So suddenly you have 40 hours of per week back. That's all yours. So free time is one component of autonomy. The other thing is the decrease in costs that we talk about. So if a lot of goods and services go down in price, then whatever money you do have is actually going to take you further. So basically your financial power is effectively increased, even if you don't make as much money. Now, that being said, the biggest problem, the elephant in the room for all this, is that trust in the American system is low. The government has a poor track record of sticking the landing on these kinds of things. And this is not something that you and I can fix. This is something that the government has to decide to fix. Now, as we wind down, we're getting closer to the end of the video. So this is kind of for us nerds, the metrologists, the metricians, who really want to say, okay, well, how do we measure this stuff? And this is just kind of like me throwing wet spaghetti at the wall. As I mentioned earlier, existing key performance indicators, KPI, like labor force participation rate, probably won't matter as much in the future. We're going to need to measure economic productivity and individual well-being through entirely different means. But this underscores the key question, which is, what are we trying to optimize for? GDP is a proxy for a lot of other things, but it's also an aggregate number that is on its own relatively useless. Just kind of like how the stock market is an aggregate number that, for you and me on a day-to-day basis, pretty useless. So one idea that I had was a well-being index, which would be based on self-determination theory. And so it would measure a population's well-being based on autonomy, mastery or competence, and connection. So that would be like, how much free time does everyone have in your nation? How much social mobility do they have in terms of the ability to live where they want and go on the vacations that they want to and take on the leisure activities that they want to? So autonomy would be a really important thing to measure and try and optimize for. Mastery or competence would be another thing. And that's a lot harder to measure in aggregate, because for some people, it looks different for everyone. For some people, mastery might be getting a third PhD. For other people, it might be joining, a football league or something. Again, it's really difficult to measure. And then finally, connection is the third component of self-determination theory, or SDT. And connection, it can easily be measured by number of friends that you have, amount of time you spend with friends and family, and that sort of thing. Another existing index is the Gini coefficient, which measures wealth distribution and wealth inequality. But again, that is just a proxy for other things, and that presumes that wealth solves all other problems, which it certainly helps. It solves a lot of problems, but it doesn't solve all problems. Another potentially valuable framework in order to create these new KPI that we might need to optimize for in post-labor economics would be Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Is everyone getting their basic needs met? Is everyone getting, and there's a lot of overlap between Maslow and SDT, so I don't need to rehash all that. So anyways, this was a really powerful deep dive. I hope you got a lot out of it, and thanks for watching.